August 19, 1944. At the Wehrmacht headquarters in East Prussia, the mood among Germany's top generals was deceptively light. The war was collapsing around them. Allied forces had broken out of Normandy, Paris was slipping away, but inside the thick stone walls of the command room, laughter echoed. The cause of their amusement? Reports from the front that General George S. Patton's Third Army was advancing faster than any German planner thought possible. Fueling that many tanks, trucks, and armored divisions at such a pace, the generals insisted was impossible. Around the great oak table, officers smirked and shook their heads. "The Americans," one remarked, "do not understand war. They are burning through their supplies faster than they can replace them. Let Patton drive as far as he wants. He will stop himself when his tanks run dry." It was more than arrogance. To the German high command, logistics were chains, not wings. They believed no army could sustain a blitzkrieg-like advance without collapsing under the weight of its own needs. And on paper, they weren't wrong. A single Sherman tank guzzled hundreds of gallons of gasoline over just a few days of combat. Multiply that by thousands, add in trucks, half-tracks, jeeps, and aircraft, and the numbers became staggering. The Wehrmacht had lived this reality. German offensives had been halted not just by enemy fire, but by empty fuel tanks. Even Hitler's most ambitious operations, the thrust into Russia, the desperate gamble of the Ardennes, were crippled by shortages. The Germans simply could not imagine a world where fuel was not the ultimate limiter. So, as the reports piled in of Patton's relentless push, German officers laughed louder. In their minds, the Americans were foolish amateurs, drunk on victory, about to overextend themselves into disaster. What they didn't yet understand was that the United States had already solved the problem they believed unsolvable. And within weeks, those same generals would choke on their laughter as an endless stream of olive-drab trucks roared across France, proving them catastrophically wrong. Because the Americans weren't just fighting with tanks. They were fighting with logistics, and they were about to unleash a supply operation unlike anything the world had ever seen. By mid-August 1944, George S. Patton's Third Army was rewriting the rules of modern warfare. After breaking out of Normandy, his armored columns surged across France with a speed that stunned friend and foe alike. In just a matter of weeks, Patton's tanks had covered distances that the Wehrmacht once believed only their blitzkrieg could achieve. Sherman tanks rolled forward day and night, clouds of dust trailing behind them, while convoys of trucks thundered down rural roads, engines straining under the weight of men, ammunition, and supplies. The pace was breathtaking. In some areas, American units advanced 75 miles in a single day. Villages that had endured years of Nazi occupation were liberated in hours. French civilians lined the roads, waving flags, showering the soldiers with flowers, and crying tears of joy. But behind the euphoria, a brutal truth gnawed at Patton. Every mile gained came at a staggering cost in gasoline. His tanks were guzzling fuel faster than the supply chain could deliver it. A Sherman burned roughly 2 gallons of gasoline for every mile. Multiply that by thousands of tanks and support vehicles, and the daily demand was astronomical, over 500,000 gallons every single day. Patton knew it. His staff officers knew it. Even Eisenhower, supreme commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, knew it. The advance that dazzled the world was on the verge of grinding to a halt, not because of German resistance, but because of empty fuel tanks. One after another, reports came in. Trucks delayed, depots running dry, convoys stretched thin. Some armored units had to park their Shermans by the roadside, waiting for fuel deliveries while the enemy regrouped. Soldiers joked bitterly that their most dangerous foe wasn't the German army, but the gasoline gauge. Meanwhile, across the lines, German generals smirked as the news filtered back. Just as they had predicted, Patton's advance was about to collapse under its own weight. The Americans had no idea, they thought, what it truly meant to sustain mechanized war. But what they didn't realize was that Patton, Eisenhower, and the entire U.S. Army were about to attempt the unthinkable. Solving the greatest logistical challenge of World War II by creating a lifeline so vast, so relentless, and so efficient that it would keep the Third Army moving when it should have stopped dead. It would be called the Red Ball Express. And once it roared to life, it would prove that American power wasn't measured just in tanks and guns, but in trucks, drivers, and the fuel that kept them moving. August 1944. Patton's tanks were drinking gasoline faster than the Allies could deliver it. Depots in Normandy overflowed with supplies, but the problem was distance. The ports were far behind the front, and the railways were either destroyed or clogged. If Patton stalled, the entire Allied advance might collapse. That's when American logistics officers made a radical decision: create a non-stop, high-speed highway supply chain dedicated entirely to fuel, ammunition, and food for the front lines. They called it the Red Ball Express. The name came from American railroad slang, where Red Ball meant a fast freight service with absolute priority. On the roads of France, it would mean the same thing: an unbroken flow of trucks that had the right of way over everything else. From Normandy to Patton's forward depots, the U.S. Army carved out special routes marked with red circles painted on signs and vehicles. These roads became the arteries of the Allied war machine. The system was simple, brutal, and brilliant. Thousands of trucks, mostly the iconic GMC 2.5-ton Deuce and a Half, were pressed into service. They drove in endless convoys, bumper to bumper, headlights blacked out at night, engines howling as they chewed up hundreds of miles without pause. And the drivers? Many were young, barely trained, and exhausted. Yet they became the lifeline of Patton's Third Army. Many were African-American soldiers. Over 75% of the Red Ball Express drivers came from segregated units that had often been sidelined. Now, history had placed the fate of the Allied advance in their hands. Orders were clear. Once on the Red Ball route, nothing could stop you. No detours, no delays, no excuses. Broken-down trucks were pushed off the road. Fuel was siphoned, cargo transferred, and the convoy thundered on. Within days, the scale was staggering. At its peak, the Red Ball Express put more than 6,000 trucks on the road, delivering 12,500 tons of supplies every single day. Gasoline, ammunition, rations. Everything Patton's men needed to keep moving flowed along this unstoppable highway of war. German generals, watching from the other side, were baffled. They had assumed the Americans would choke on their own logistics. Instead, they watched in disbelief as Patton's tanks kept rolling, fueled by a supply chain that had no precedent in military history. The Red Ball Express wasn't just a supply operation. It was an act of audacity, a bet that sheer determination and endless trucks could outrun the limits of distance, destruction, and even exhaustion. And the gamble was paying off. Patton's advance didn't just continue, it accelerated. The Red Ball Express wasn't glamorous. It wasn't clean, and it certainly wasn't safe. Most drivers were barely out of their teens, and many had never driven a truck before the war. Now they were thrown into convoys of 10, 20, sometimes 50 trucks long, roaring across bombed-out roads of France. Their orders were simple and brutal: keep moving, no matter what. The roads were a nightmare: craters, collapsed bridges, mud that could swallow a truck whole. Convoys snaked through twisting French lanes, often under blackout conditions. Headlights were painted over with slits so thin they gave off only a faint glow. At night, drivers often couldn't see the truck in front of them, just the faint outline of tires or exhaust sparks in the dark. One wrong turn meant crashing into a ditch, or worse, being left behind. And yet, the trucks kept rolling. Breakdowns were constant. Engines overheated, tires shredded, brakes failed on steep French hills. But the rule was absolute: never stop the convoy. If a truck broke down, it was shoved off the road, cargo stripped in minutes, and the line thundered on. Drivers learned to siphon fuel by mouth, fix an engine in the dark with a flashlight between their teeth, and push a truck out of mud with nothing but raw muscle. The dangers weren't just mechanical. German planes prowled overhead, hunting convoys. The Luftwaffe called the Red Ball Express a rolling target. At night, snipers ambushed trucks. Mines tore through tires and fuel cans, turning convoys into blazing infernos. Still, the men drove on. Most of the drivers were African-American soldiers, members of segregated units. Many had been dismissed by the Army as unfit for combat duty. Now they carried the Allied advance on their shoulders. Historian accounts later admitted, without these men, Patton's tanks would have stopped dead in France. They drove up to 16 hours a day, sleeping in the cab when they could, living on cold rations, and pushing their trucks until both man and machine were ready to collapse. There are countless stories of grit. Drivers repairing an engine while shells exploded around them. Convoys racing across open ground as German planes strafed, never breaking formation. Men too exhausted to eat, falling asleep at the wheel, only to wake as the truck lurched over a crater. The Red Ball Express was a miracle, yes, but it was a miracle paid for with sweat, exhaustion, and no small amount of blood. Yet, despite every danger, despite every breakdown, the trucks delivered. Day after day, night after night. It was the unshakable determination of these drivers, the unsung heroes of the war, that kept Patton's steel juggernaut fueled and moving. For German commanders, the Allied breakout in Normandy was terrifying enough. But what truly stunned them wasn't the tanks. It was the fuel that never seemed to stop flowing. By September 1944, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt and his staff began to notice something chilling. Whenever a panzer division managed to destroy American vehicles, more appeared within hours. Artillery barrages that should have stalled an advance were useless. Fresh supplies of shells arrived almost instantly. To German eyes, it looked like the Americans had limitless reserves. One colonel, captured later, admitted, "We could not understand it. Your tanks moved day and night, always with fuel. Ours often stood idle, waiting for a few gallons." The German army was strangled by shortages. Their supply convoys crawled on horse-drawn wagons. Trains were blown apart by Allied bombers. By 1944, even elite panzer divisions were running on fumes. Entire battalions were abandoned because they had no gasoline to move. In sharp contrast, the Red Ball Express created an illusion of American invincibility. Patton's Third Army, especially, seemed unstoppable. German scouts reported convoys of trucks stretching for miles, an endless line of fuel and ammunition roaring forward. The psychological impact was devastating. Soldiers in the Wehrmacht began whispering, "The Americans fight with gasoline." One German diary entry from late 1944 summed up their despair. "Our tanks are superior, but without fuel they are iron coffins. The Americans, with their trucks, fight with an army behind the army. How can we hope to match that?" It wasn't just about firepower anymore. It was about momentum. Every time the Germans tried to regroup, the Americans kept pushing, fueled by that lifeline of trucks. Every time the panzers planned a counterattack, they found themselves too short on gasoline to even begin. By the time intelligence reports confirmed the existence of the Red Ball Express, it was too late. German command realized they weren't just losing battles, they were losing the logistics war. In a war where speed, firepower, and supply meant survival, the Germans saw the truth with brutal clarity. The side that mastered logistics would win the war. General George S. Patton lived for speed. To him, war wasn't won by sitting still, it was won by moving faster than the enemy could react. And in late summer of 1944, he had the perfect weapon, the Red Ball Express. With his Third Army freshly unleashed after the breakout from Normandy, Patton ordered his tanks and infantry to keep pushing day and night. His motto was simple: keep them moving. But moving an entire army at that pace required a miracle. Each Sherman tank guzzled almost 3 gallons of gasoline per mile. A single armored division needed hundreds of thousands of gallons just to keep advancing. Normally, that would have been impossible. But thanks to the Red Ball Express, Patton had something no general in history had ever possessed: a constant flood of fuel, ammunition, and rations delivered directly to the front. Eyewitnesses recalled the sight vividly: endless convoys of trucks, headlights dimmed, engines roaring through the French countryside. Young drivers, many just 18 or 19, risking ambushes and accidents as they sped toward the front without rest. Fuel drums piled high, ammunition boxes stacked to the sky, all bouncing on the muddy roads as the trucks never stopped rolling. Patton himself marveled at it. "My men can eat their belts," he once said, "but my tanks have got to have gas." and the Red Ball gave it to him thousands of gallons every hour. With that lifeline, Patton's Third Army achieved one of the most extraordinary advances in military history. In just 2 weeks, his forces swept across nearly 600 miles of France. German troops were stunned. How could the Americans keep moving so relentlessly? The truth was simple. Logistics had become Patton's secret weapon. The Red Ball Express turned fuel into firepower, trucks into unstoppable momentum. By early September, Patton's armored columns were racing toward the German border, so fast that they outran their own maps. They advanced faster than anyone thought possible. Faster even than the planners of the Red Ball had imagined. But this breathtaking speed came at a cost. Drivers collapsed from exhaustion. Trucks broke down under the strain. And still, the demand for fuel never stopped. Patton's push would soon run into its greatest challenge, the limits of supply. Still, in that brief window, the Red Ball Express didn't just keep an army alive. It changed the rhythm of the war. Patton's charge showed the world what was possible when logistics turned into lightning. By September 1944, the Red Ball Express had become legendary. Nearly 6,000 trucks thundered down French roads every day, hauling everything from gasoline and bullets to rations and spare tank parts. But behind the legend was a grimmer reality. The system was beginning to break under its own weight. Every Red Ball driver knew the truth. This was no ordinary mission. They drove on little to no sleep, often surviving on black coffee, cigarettes, and whatever rations they could grab. One driver recalled, "We drove until we could barely see. Some of us fell asleep with our eyes open. You just kept the truck on the road and prayed." The roads themselves turned into nightmares. Heavy rains turned the French countryside into seas of mud. Trucks sank into ditches, bridges collapsed under the endless convoys, and dust clouds choked both men and engines. Mechanics worked around the clock, cannibalizing broken trucks for parts just to keep others rolling. And then there was the danger. German fighter bombers prowled the skies. Ambushes by scattered Wehrmacht units harassed convoys. Even French civilians, desperate after years of hunger, sometimes swarmed trucks to grab food. Despite these hardships, the Red Ball kept rolling. But the sheer demand was impossible to satisfy. Patton's tanks burned fuel faster than trucks could deliver it. Entire divisions sometimes had to halt, not because of German resistance, but because their fuel trucks hadn't arrived yet. The soldiers at the front called it gasoline starvation. General Eisenhower himself admitted it. "We were at the end of a shoestring." Logistics, not German firepower, was slowing the Allied advance. For the drivers, the strain was unrelenting. Some made 3 runs a day, racking up hundreds of miles without rest. Wrecks littered the roadside. Overturned trucks, smashed engines, and burned-out vehicles told the story of the cost. Yet, through all of this, the Red Ball Express never quit. Its young drivers, many of them African-American soldiers serving in segregated units, proved that endurance, grit, and determination could keep the lifeline alive. The strain showed, the cracks widened, but the trucks kept rolling, mile after mile, as September 1944 dragged on. The Red Ball Express was more than a supply route. It was a race against time. Patton's Third Army had punched deep into eastern France, threatening the very heart of Germany. But every mile gained brought greater risk. His tanks drank gasoline faster than trucks could deliver it, and if the flow faltered, his advance would grind to a halt. Meanwhile, the German high command, though battered, was far from finished. Hitler had ordered his generals to launch sharp counterattacks wherever Allied supply lines looked weakest. And nothing looked more vulnerable than the endless convoys of the Red Ball Express. On narrow French roads, convoys stretched for miles, easy prey for ambushes, mines, and Luftwaffe strafing runs. Drivers recalled how the sky would suddenly scream with German fighters, and you just held on to the wheel, praying you wouldn't be the one hit. Anti-aircraft crews rode shotgun in some convoys, but they couldn't stop every attack. Burned-out trucks, still smoldering, often marked the path. The Germans also targeted bridges and railways feeding into the Red Ball's routes. Each time, American engineers raced to repair them, sometimes under fire, laying down temporary spans overnight to keep the trucks rolling. But the most dangerous threat wasn't the Luftwaffe or stray German units. It was the German counterattack in the Ardennes. Though still weeks away, intelligence reports whispered of German units regrouping, preparing for a desperate strike. To Patton and Eisenhower, this meant one thing: the Red Ball had to keep fuel and ammunition pouring forward at all costs. The convoys became battlefields in their own right. Drivers carried rifles on their laps, ready to fight. Some recalled ambushes in dark forests where headlights had to be turned off, leaving men to drive blind, feeling the road more than seeing it. And yet, the Red Ball Express endured. The Germans may have slowed the convoys, but they never broke them. Each day, thousands of tons of fuel and supplies reached Patton's armored spearheads. Each mile brought the Allies closer to Germany itself. The Red Ball wasn't just delivering fuel, it was outpacing German recovery. It was turning a counterattack into a desperate defense. By October 1944, the Red Ball Express had been running non-stop for nearly 2 months. More than 412,000 tons of supplies had been hauled. Trucks covered over 11 million miles in just 82 days. Patton's Third Army, along with other Allied units, still had fuel in their tanks, ammunition in their guns, and food on their tables. But it came at a price. The drivers were exhausted. The trucks were breaking down faster than mechanics could repair them. And yet, the Allies had reached a critical turning point. German generals had been certain that Patton's offensive would grind to a halt long before the borders of the Reich. They had laughed at American logistics, believing the US lacked the discipline and experience to sustain high-speed warfare. They were wrong. The Red Ball Express had not only proven them wrong, it had humiliated their assumptions. Patton's tanks were now pressing into Lorraine, threatening the Siegfried Line itself. And in a stroke of bitter irony, German officers captured during this period admitted their shock. "We expected your army to run out of fuel. Instead, you drove faster than we thought possible." By the time the Red Ball officially shut down in November 1944, its mission was complete. Allied armies had secured new ports like Antwerp, easing the supply crisis. But without those 82 relentless days, the Allied advance might have stalled fatally, giving Germany time to regroup and prolong the war. The Red Ball Express was the pivot, the operation that ensured momentum never faltered. When the last convoy rolled in, the drivers finally breathed. They had carried the weight of an entire war on their shoulders and wheels. Most of them were never decorated. Many were never even remembered. But history quietly knows the truth. The Red Ball Express was not just a supply line. It was a victory forged by grit, endurance, and the unsung heroes behind the wheel. It showed that logistics wins wars as surely as tanks and guns. It proved that America's strength lay not just in weapons, but in the ability to move, feed, and fuel millions of men across an ocean and into battle. And it revealed the irony. The German Wehrmacht, once famed for its blitzkrieg, was outpaced and outsupplied by the very enemy it had mocked. One veteran driver later summed it up best. "We didn't fire the big guns. We didn't storm the bunkers. But without us, none of it could have happened." The Red Ball was the heartbeat of victory. Today, the Red Ball Express remains one of the greatest logistics feats in history. A story of young men, roaring engines, and endless roads that carried the Allies to ultimate triumph.